Lyndon Hanson stared at the same stain on the rug for the third hour of the afternoon. The apartment was silent, save for the hum of a refrigerator that had nothing in it. Jobless, grieving, and anchored to a friend's couch, he had stopped counting the days since he last stepped outside. The world outside felt distant, noisy, and entirely irrelevant. Then came the rhythm of heavy footsteps in the hallway. A sharp, rhythmic pounding on the door shattered the air. George and Scott did not wait for an invitation. They walked in, grabbed his arm, and hoisted him off the cushions before he could protest. They did not offer sympathy. They offered a flight. Bags were packed in minutes, dragging him from the stagnant air of his living room into the bright, sharp light of a waiting car. Within hours, the concrete of the city vanished, replaced by the vast, undulating blue of the Caribbean. The boat rocked against the dock, ropes groaning under the tension of the tide. Lyndon stepped onto the deck, the salt air hitting his lungs, and for the first time in months, the weight in his chest shifted. Scott reached into a bag and pulled out a pair of clogs. They were molded from a strange, lightweight resin, perforated with holes, and held together by a backstrap. He tossed them onto the deck. Lyndon and George stared at the foam structures, their expressions shifting from curiosity to blunt disbelief. They were clunky, awkward, and undeniably strange. "They are ugly," Lyndon stated, the word hanging in the salt air. George agreed, shaking his head at the sight of them. Scott did not argue. He simply pushed them forward with his foot. Reluctantly, Lyndon slid his feet into the resin shells. He stood up, shifted his weight, and rocked back on his heels. The material didn't give way. It gripped the deck floor, stable and firm. He took a step, then another. The cushioning was immediate, absorbing the impact of the swaying boat. The skepticism drained from his face as he realized the utility outperformed the aesthetics. George tried them next, testing the grip against the shifting deck. They walked, paced, and stood for hours as the sun moved across the horizon. By the time they sat down, the initial repulsion had vanished. They looked at the resin objects with new intent. They had found the future, and it was entirely unlike anything they had ever seen. The 2002 Florida Boat Show was a sea of polished leather and high-end gear. Lyndon, George, and Scott stood at their booth, but the crowd walked right past them. People glanced at the resin shoes, wrinkled their noses, and kept moving. The rejection was immediate and absolute. George grabbed a pair from the display, looked at the bustling aisle, and made a choice. He didn't wait for a customer to approach. He hurled the shoe toward a passing stranger. The man caught it, startled, and looked back. Instead of apologizing, the trio shouted for him to put it on. The tactic was loud, invasive, and impossible to ignore. Passers-by stopped, confused and annoyed, but the founders pressed the advantage. They forced the shoes into hands, demanding that people test the feel for themselves. The skepticism began to break under the sheer intensity of the sales pitch. One by one, people slipped them on, felt the grip, and stopped walking. The mockery turned into surprise, and surprise turned into a transaction. By the time the lights dimmed on the final day, they had moved 200 pairs. They had not just sold a product, they had forced the market to pay attention. The momentum shifted from the docks to the concrete floors of reality. In hospitals, nurses spent 12-hour shifts on their feet, their legs aching, their endurance fraying. They found the resin clogs, tested the grip, and never looked back. In busy kitchens, chefs navigating slick, grease-heavy environments discovered a level of stability they had never known. One pair turned into 10, then hundreds, then thousands across the country. The brand was no longer a curiosity. It was a necessity for the overworked. The founders watched the demand spike, their small operation ballooning into a national phenomenon. They pushed the production lines to capacity, matching the frantic pace of the market. By 2006, the scale of their success demanded a new stage. They prepared for the public markets, a move that left veteran shoe executives stunned. When the numbers finally tallied, the results shook the industry to its core. They raised $239 million in their initial public offering, It was the largest debut in the history of the footwear trade. The skepticism of the early days had been incinerated by the sheer force of their ascent, placing a polarizing, foam-based company at the center of the financial world. The record-breaking IPO was the peak, but the descent began before the celebratory champagne had gone flat. The pressure of managing a multi-million-dollar entity fractured the trio from within. George Boedecker, once the loudest voice in the room, began to lose his grip on the professional standard the company required. His behavior grew volatile and unpredictable. He became a fixture in police reports, his actions spiraling far beyond the boardroom. During a traffic stop, he claimed a major pop star was riding in his passenger seat, a claim that crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. He did not stop there. He turned his aggression toward his own family members, issuing threats that made his position at the company untenable. The board of directors held emergency meetings behind locked doors. They watched their stock value and their reputation wither as the news cycle turned against them. They had no choice. They moved to terminate his role and strip him of his authority. The decision was final and brutal. As George was ousted, the company lost more than just a founder. They lost the illusion of stability. The internal structure, once forged by friendship and hustle, began to buckle under the weight of his unraveling. The instability of the leadership was only the first blow. Then the global economy seized. In 2008, the financial crisis swept through every sector, and the company found itself overextended, carrying millions of dollars in unsold inventory that nobody wanted. The market turned hostile overnight. Simultaneously, the legal walls began to close in. Competitors filed a barrage of lawsuits, claiming the core resin design was stolen property. Every dollar gained during the IPO era was now being bled out in courtrooms and warehouse storage fees. The brand, once a symbol of explosive growth, became a punchline. Retailers cleared the shelves, dumping the clogs into bargain bins where they gathered dust. Consumers stopped buying, and investors fled as the stock price cratered. The public verdict was swift and unforgiving. Critics declared the trend officially dead, branding the shoes an embarrassing relic of a failed experiment. The offices went silent. The growth stopped. For the next decade, the company barely kept its head above water, trapped in a cycle of litigation and irrelevance. The once celebrated icon was now just a pile of plastic, waiting for the end. The death sentence was already written by the critics, but the company refused to sign it. They stopped looking at the balance sheets and started looking at the product. They had spent years trying to make the shoes look conventional, trying to blend in, and it had failed. The team sat in a quiet boardroom and made a choice that defied every rule of retail. They stopped apologizing for the design. They stopped hiding the bulk. They turned the very trait that people mocked, the raw, unrefined shape of the resin, into their primary weapon. They decided that if the world called them ugly, they would own the term. They pivoted the marketing strategy overnight. No more claims of high-fashion elegance. Instead, they sold the shoes as a badge of defiance, a symbol for those who prioritize their own comfort over the expectations of others. They leaned into the polarization. If you hated the look, that was the point. They cultivated a brand identity built on being loud, being different, and being utterly indifferent to public shame. The shift was radical. They stopped chasing the mainstream and started targeting the outsiders, the people who wore their choices like armor. The pivot was not just a change in advertising. It was a total reclamation of their own identity. The strategy was no longer about persuasion. It was about shock. They reached out to musicians and fast food chains, forcing the public to confront the impossible. When the collaboration with Post Malone dropped, the internet stalled. Fans lined up digitally, refreshing pages as the limited stock vanished in seconds. Then came the partnership with KFC. They released a version that smelled exactly like fried chicken, complete with rubbery charms of drumsticks attached to the surface. It was absurd. It was offensive to traditional fashion sensibilities, and it sold out instantly. People who once mocked the brand were now fighting for a spot in the queue. The collaboration stripped away the last vestiges of the old, ridiculed image. Every drop became an event, a test of how much chaos the consumer would accept. They weren't just buying footwear anymore. They were buying into the absurdity. The high-demand scarcity created a frenzy that turned the clogs into the most talked-about item on social media. The shift was absolute. The brand had successfully weaponized the ridicule, turning a decade-old punchline into a must-have cultural artifact that proved, beyond doubt, that the uglier the shoe, the faster it disappeared from the shelves. The final barrier was the most rigid, the high-fashion establishment of Paris. For years, the industry had treated the clogs as a social error, something to be avoided at all costs. But the brand had become too loud to ignore. Balenciaga broke the silence. They took the familiar resin form, lifted it onto heavy platform soles, and placed it on the center of the runway. The lights hit the material, and the audience leaned in. It was a calculated subversion of luxury. The clogs were no longer just for kitchens or hospital wards. They were now objects of high-end desire. When the models walked, the clatter of the thick soles against the floorboard signaled a total shift in perception. Critics who had once laughed were now scrambling to analyze the aesthetic. It was the ultimate validation. By occupying the space of high fashion, the brand forced the world to reconsider what constituted value. The clogs were no longer a joke. They were a status symbol. They had successfully navigated the path from a garage-made prototype to the most exclusive stages in the world. The transition was absolute, turning the very object that once invited ridicule into the pinnacle of modern, high-fashion demand. The journey from a friend's couch in 2002 to a multi-billion-dollar empire was never linear. It was a chaotic, often brutal climb. The brand survived lawsuits, financial crashes, and a decade of being labeled a passing fad. Yet, it persisted. The secret was not in changing the product, but in changing the narrative. They stopped apologizing for the look. They stopped trying to fit into the conventional mold of the footwear industry. By leaning into the very criticism that once threatened to sink them, they proved that authenticity has its own market value. Today, the clogs are recognized across the globe, a symbol of bold, unapologetic individuality. They remain as they were on that first day on the deck, simple, functional, and impossible to ignore. The founders had no industry experience, only the tenacity to keep pushing against the tide of public opinion. They took a design that was mocked, rejected, and dismissed, and they transformed it into an enduring icon. In the end, the success of the brand serves as a testament to a single, powerful truth. If you refuse to hide who you are, the world will eventually have to clear a space for you. The ridicule did not stop them. It defined their legacy.